Get up. Walk out. Do not say one word to your husband." Claire's hands went cold. The wineglass froze halfway to her lips. Across the candlelit table, Daniel was still smiling, the same smile that had made her say yes, the same smile she had trusted for 2.5 years. The text was from her brother, the brother who hadn't spoken to her in 2 years, the brother who had no reason to contact her tonight of all nights, their anniversary, unless something was catastrophically wrong. She set the glass down. She smiled back at her husband, and she made the hardest decision of her life. If someone has ever smiled at you while hiding everything, subscribe right now, drop your city in the comments, and don't go anywhere. Claire Montgomery had not cried at her own wedding. People had noticed. Her mother's best friend had leaned over to her sister during the reception and whispered something about it, not quietly enough, and Claire had heard every word from 6 feet away. She didn't take offense. She understood what it looked like from the outside. A bride who stood at the altar, dry-eyed, composed, almost businesslike in the way she said her vows, like she was closing a deal instead of beginning a life. What none of them understood was that Claire had already used up every tear she had. She had spent them over 14 months of grief, of legal paperwork, of learning how to run a company she had helped build, but never expected to inherit so soon and so suddenly. When her parents died, a highway accident on a Tuesday morning in October, 2 years before that wedding, Claire had cried until she didn't think she had anything left. And then she had gotten up, put on a suit, and walked into the boardroom of Montgomery Design Group and told 62 people that the company was going to be fine. She was 32 years old. She had no idea if the company was going to be fine, but she had said it with enough certainty that everyone in the room had believed her, and that had been enough to start. So when Daniel Hayes appeared at a charity gala 14 months later, tall, easy in his own skin, dark blonde with the kind of quiet confidence that came from never having needed to perform it, and asked her what she was afraid of, Claire had laughed in genuine surprise. "Nothing," she said. And he had said, "That's the most dangerous answer a person can give." She had thought about that line for weeks. She had replayed the conversation in the car on the way home, in the shower the next morning, in the margins of meeting notes she was supposed to be paying attention to. It wasn't the line itself. It was the fact that he had looked at her, really looked, not at her title or her firm or the name her parents had spent 30 years building, and asked a question that assumed she was complicated, that assumed there was something under the surface worth finding. Nobody had done that in a very long time. They were married 14 months after they met. Small ceremony, Cape Cod, just close friends, and the brother she was no longer speaking to, Marcus, who had been invited out of obligation and had declined without explanation, which had hurt more than she wanted to admit. Daniel's family was small, scattered, mostly absent. He had explained it without drama. Old family, he said, the kind where people drift apart and send cards at Christmas and don't ask hard questions. She had understood that. She had been becoming that kind of family herself. Tonight was their first anniversary. Harlow's was the kind of restaurant that required 3 months' notice and a reason. And Daniel had somehow secured the corner table by the harbor window, the one with the candlelight and the city reflected in the water below, and the particular kind of privacy that came from being in a very public room where everyone was too well-dressed to stare. He had ordered her wine before they sat down, a Burgundy she had mentioned exactly once, almost offhandedly, in a conversation about a business dinner 6 months ago. She had noted it at the time that he remembered and filed it under the category of evidence that she had chosen correctly. She was watching him cut into his lamb chop, half listening to a story about a sailing trip in his 20s, when her phone buzzed against the tablecloth. She glanced at it the way you do when you're expecting nothing in particular. The name on the screen made her breath stop. Marcus. Not a spam number, not a work contact. Her brother. Her estranged, unreachable, hadn't returned a call in 2 years brother Marcus, whose silence had been so complete and so sustained that Claire had eventually stopped filing it under things that hurt, and started filing it under facts of her life. She opened the message. Claire, it's me. Get up right now. Walk to the bathroom. Do not say anything to Daniel. I am not joking. Your life depends on it. The room did not change. The candles kept burning. Daniel kept talking. The table beside them laughed at something. The harbor lights kept reflecting in the window. Claire set the phone down face first on the tablecloth and felt the specific cold that comes not from temperature, but from a recognition your conscious mind hasn't processed yet, but your body already has. Everything okay? Daniel asked. He had stopped mid-sentence. He was watching her with that expression she had always called attentiveness, the quality of being genuinely present, of noticing when her mood shifted, of caring enough to ask. She had loved that about him from almost the beginning. Work email, she said. Her voice came out completely level. Nothing urgent. On our anniversary? He tilted his head slightly, reproachful and fond at once. Tell whoever it is that Mrs. Claire Hayes is completely unavailable tonight. She smiled. She picked up her wineglass with a hand that did not shake. She took one sip and set it back down. You're right, she said. Absolutely right. And for the next 4 minutes, she sat across from her husband at their anniversary dinner and maintained a conversation about a sailing trip she no longer cared about, while the message from her brother pulsed behind her eyes like a second heartbeat. Her face did the work her training had given it, the training of 11 years, sitting across from difficult clients, hostile contractors, aggressive competitors who thought a woman in her early 30s running a $40 million firm was an opportunity rather than an obstacle. Her face knew how to be calm. Her face had been doing this work since she was 23 years old. Her hands were a different matter. She kept them below the table. Excuse me, she said, standing. I need a minute. Daniel started to rise. She waved him down with a small, easy gesture. Finish your story. I'll be right back. She walked to the restroom at a pace she hoped looked like nothing at all. Inside, with the door locked, she stood in front of the mirror for exactly 3 seconds. Then she called her brother. He answered before the first ring finished. Are you alone? Marcus said. Yes. What is going on? How much do you trust Daniel? His voice was tight and controlled in the way their fathers had been when he was managing something serious. Not panicked, deliberate. The question should have been easy. It should have been immediate. I trust him completely would have been the honest answer 2 hours ago. But something in the particular stillness of Marcus's voice stopped the automatic response before it arrived. Tell me what you know, Claire said instead. I hired someone, 8 months ago, an investigator named Sandra Voss, former FBI, Financial Fraud Division. I hired her because something about Daniel bothered me and I couldn't name it, and I know that sounds irrational, but Claire, I was right to be worried. Marcus, his name isn't Daniel Hayes. His name is David Holt. He's from Providence. He has a fraud conviction in New Hampshire under a different alias and a civil judgment in Vermont and at least 2 previous women he did this to, wealthy women, recently bereaved. He married them, restructured their finances, and disappeared with everything they had. The marble counter was cool under her palms. She was holding on to it without having decided to. He's done this before, she said, at least twice that Sandra can confirm. A woman in Philadelphia named Renee Stafford, a woman in Washington named Victoria Crane. Both lost everything. Claire, tonight specifically, is when he planned to do it to you. Sandra intercepted communications between Daniel and an associate. The plan is to introduce something into your drink during dinner, take you home, and have you sign documents transferring control of Montgomery Design Group while you're not thinking clearly. By tomorrow morning, he would have access to everything. The room was very quiet. She could hear the restaurant on the other side of the door, silverware, low conversation, the particular ambient sound of an expensive evening. How much? She said. The company, all of it. Sandra's estimate is the full liquidated value of your liquid assets, around 12 to 15 million in immediately accessible funds. And your parents built that company, Claire. His voice cracked slightly, briefly. He pulled it back. "I'm asking you to leave, right now. Don't go back to the table. Take a car to my apartment. I'll text you the address." "I need 5 minutes," she said. "Claire, I need 5 minutes, Marcus. I'm not running out of a restaurant without understanding what I'm running from. Talk to me. Who is this investigator? How good is she?" And so he told her. In the marble-tiled restroom of Harlow's, while her husband ate his lamb chop 20 meters away and the anniversary wine sat untouched on the table, Marcus told her everything Sandra Voss had found over 8 months of investigation. David Holt had been constructing identities for at least 11 years. The fake history was extraordinary in its detail. College transcripts, professional references, a manufactured family history going back 3 generations. Old Connecticut money, timber, and banking, the kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself. The persona had been built to be precisely appealing to a specific type of woman: successful, independent, recently bereaved, emotionally open in the particular way that grief creates, and most importantly, in possession of substantial inherited assets with no close family members positioned to notice something wrong. Claire had been all of those things. She had been all of those things, and she had not known it. And now, standing in a restaurant bathroom in a dress she had chosen 3 days ago, she understood for the first time what she had looked like from the outside. Not a woman who had survived and built and persevered. A target, a profile, a very well-researched opportunity. "The woman in Philadelphia," she said. "What happened to her legally?" "She fought it. 3 years. Lost. The documentation was too good. She had signed everything voluntarily, and the courts ruled the transfers were authorized. She's rebuilding, but slowly." "And the woman in Washington?" Silence for a moment. "She didn't fight. She just left. Sandra tracked her down. She's willing to talk to you, but it took 2 years before she was willing to say anything to anyone." Claire looked at herself in the mirror. She was 34 years old. She was wearing the pearl earrings Daniel had given her for Christmas. She had a company to run, 62 people depending on her, a mortgage on a house she had spent a year renovating, a brother she hadn't spoken to in 2 years who was now standing between her and the most thorough betrayal of her adult life. "I'm coming to you," she said. "Text me your address." She unlocked the door. She walked back through the restaurant. She registered, with the particular precision of someone who had just recalibrated everything, the way Daniel's face moved when he saw her coming, the slight brightening, the instinctive forward lean, the smile that had always felt like coming home. She cataloged it now as evidence. "I'm so sorry," she said, setting her hand on his shoulder as she reached the table. "I'm not feeling well. I think it might be coming on fast. Headache, maybe a little dizzy." His concern was immediate. "Let me take you home." "No, please, finish your dinner. You know I hate making a production of things." She leaned down and kissed his cheek. She smelled his cologne, the same one he had worn since the night they met. "I'll take a car. You enjoy the rest of the evening. I'll be asleep by the time you get home." "You sure?" His hand covered hers on his shoulder. His eyes were searching her face with that particular quality of attention she had loved. "I don't mind leaving." "I'm sure," she said. "I love you." "I love you too." He squeezed her hand. "Feel better. I'll be home soon." She walked out of Harlow's with her coat over her arm and her purse on her shoulder, and her face doing the work she had asked it to do for the past 15 minutes. She did not look back. She got to the sidewalk and pulled out her phone and ordered a car and stood in the cold November air of Boston and breathed until the shaking in her hands settled into something manageable. Her phone buzzed. Marcus's address, Cambridge, 20 minutes from the restaurant. Then, 30 seconds later, a text from Daniel. "Hope you're feeling better, sweetheart. Taking care of the check. Don't wait up. Love you." She read it twice. She understood, reading it a second time, that she was reading the work of someone who had been constructing messages like this for years. The exact right warmth, the exact right casualness, the particular combination of affection and freedom that said, "I love you and I am not worried about anything at all." She got into the car and told herself, very deliberately, that she was not going to fall apart. Not in the backseat of a rideshare, not tonight. There was too much to do, and she had never had the luxury of falling apart at inopportune moments, and tonight was not going to be the first time she started. She made it 4 blocks before the tears came anyway. They weren't the tears she expected, not grief, not fear, not even the particular corrosive humiliation of having been fooled. They were rage. Pure, clean, specific rage. The kind that comes when you finally understand the full dimensions of something that has been done to you. And the understanding arrives not as a wound, but as a fire. 2.5 years. She had given 2.5 years to a man who had spent 6 months researching her before they ever met, who had stood at a charity gala with a glass of scotch and a question he had prepared in advance, asking her what she was afraid of, because he already knew the answer. Because the answer was in her public profile, her social media, the news coverage of her parents' accident, the court filings for the estate, all of it accessible to anyone who knew where to look and was patient enough to build something from it. He had built her. He had built a version of her, the grieving daughter, the lonely woman, the heir who was too busy and too overwhelmed to look carefully at every document, every signature, every recommendation from a lawyer she had never heard of before Daniel introduced him. And he had loved that version with such consistent, convincing warmth that she had never thought to look behind it. The car turned off the main road, Cambridge. Narrower streets, older buildings, the particular density of a neighborhood that housed researchers and artists and people who had chosen to live near universities because they believed ideas mattered. Marcus was standing in the lobby when she walked in. He was 40 years old, and she could see their father in him, the jaw, the way he stood, the particular quality of stillness that their father had possessed in difficult moments. There was gray at his temples that hadn't been there at the funeral. He looked tired in the specific way of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had not let himself put it down. He crossed the lobby in 4 steps and put his arms around her and said nothing. She held on. She had not realized how much she needed the specific fact of her brother until she was standing in a lobby in Cambridge at 10:15 on a Wednesday night, still in her anniversary dress, still wearing the pearls Daniel had given her, and Marcus was there, and he was solid, and he was real, and whatever had happened between them 2 years ago was not the thing that mattered right now. "I'm sorry," he said into her hair. "I'm sorry I wasn't there sooner. I'm sorry I let 2 years go by." She pulled back and looked at him. "Tell me everything," she said. "All of it." The woman waiting upstairs was Sandra Voss. She was in her mid-50s, precise and unhurried, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the particular calm of someone who had spent decades in rooms where very high stakes were being decided. She shook Claire's hand, met her eyes, and said, "I'm glad you're here. I'm sorry about the circumstances." Marcus's apartment was exactly what she would have expected. Bookshelves everywhere, a second desk that looked like a research station, the organized chaos of a serious mind that worked better in its own system than anyone else's. On the dining table, he had already spread out what looked like months of accumulated documentation, bank records, printed photographs, legal filings, a detailed organizational chart with names and connecting lines. Claire sat down at the table, still in her coat, and looked at the spread of paper that represented the past 8 months of a private investigation into the man she had married. She did not feel small. She did not feel stupid. She felt something different, the specific activation that happens when a serious person is confronted with a serious problem and recognizes it as solvable. "Start from the beginning," she said. Sandra sat down across from her and opened her laptop. His real name is David Holt, born in Providence, Rhode Island in 1979. Father worked in manufacturing. He was genuinely brilliant in school. I want to be clear about that because it's important to understand what you're dealing with. He won a partial scholarship to study finance, dropped out in his second year. The first documented alias appears 11 years ago in New Hampshire. A minor fraud conviction, mostly document forgery. He treated it as a learning experience. He got better, Claire said. Significantly. Each operation since then has been more sophisticated. The alias construction alone would be impressive if it weren't criminal. He doesn't just take a fake name, he builds a life. References, professional history, fabricated family background, social proof. Everything calibrated to appeal to a specific target profile. Me. You fit the profile precisely, Sandra said. It was not an apology. It was a fact delivered without condescension. Recently bereaved, significant inherited assets, emotionally open in the way that grief creates, running a complex business with limited personal support infrastructure, and estranged from the family member most likely to notice something wrong. She paused. That last piece was part of what he was working on. Your estrangement from Marcus wasn't accidental. It was encouraged. Claire was very still. What do you mean? Small things. Comments about Marcus's motives. Observations about how your brother had disappeared when you needed him. The occasional suggestion that the people who had been in your life before Daniel were perhaps not as trustworthy as they appeared. Nothing overt, just persistent, gentle, very patient pressure over 2 years. Claire thought about 6 specific conversations. Things Daniel had said that she had absorbed as his perspective, his insight into the people around her. The way he had framed Marcus's absence, not as something that had happened between 2 grieving people who had handled loss badly, but as a character judgment, as evidence. He was making sure I didn't have anyone to warn me, she said. Yes. How much has he already taken? Marcus and Sandra exchanged a brief look. Marcus reached into a folder and pulled out a set of bank statements. $1.9 million so far, he said, through 3 shell companies with variations of legitimate-sounding corporate names, all controlled through nominee ownership that traces back to David Holt. $1.9 million. Her parents had worked 30 years for the money that had built into what Montgomery Design Group had become. $1.9 million was the beginning. Tonight was supposed to be the end. The documents I'd be signing, she said, what exactly do they authorize? Full power of attorney over the firm's operating accounts, Sandra said, restructuring of the primary trust to grant him sole access, and a series of investment transfers that, once initiated, would move the bulk of your liquid assets within 48 hours into accounts structured so that recovery would take years and might ultimately be incomplete. Can he legally do this? If I sign under duress, under a sedative, that's the complicated part, Sandra said. The documents are correctly executed. If you sign them, regardless of the circumstances, he has legal authorization. Proving duress requires proof of the impairment, which requires the substance to be identified in your system, which requires a blood test, which requires you to know to ask for one before it metabolizes, by which point he is gone and your lawyers are trying to untangle a paper trail that was designed to be untangleable. The full architecture of it settled into place. It was extraordinary, in the way that something meticulously planned and deeply wrong could be extraordinary. He had not left a gap. He had thought about every contingency, prepared for every reasonable response, constructed every layer with the patience of someone who understood that the most effective traps were the ones the victim walked into believing they were safe. He had spent 6 months researching her before they met. He had spent 2.5 years becoming the person she trusted most in the world. He had been kind to her, genuinely and consistently kind, in the particular way that professional cruelty sometimes has to be. "What's our window?" she asked. "He's expecting you to be at home, sedated, ready to sign," Sandra said. "When he arrives and finds you gone, he'll try to reach you first. If he can't, he'll move to contingencies. The associate, the man posing as your family attorney, has the documents ready to execute. If David can get you to sign anything tonight or tomorrow morning, the transfers can be initiated." "Then we freeze the accounts tonight," Claire said. She reached for her phone and scrolled to Catherine Park's number, her corporate attorney. 9 years with the firm, Harvard-educated and formidably good at exactly the kind of emergency motion that needed to be filed in the next 3 hours. Catherine answered on the 3rd ring. Claire told her in 2 minutes. Catherine said, "I'll be at the office in 30 minutes. Bring everything Sandra has." As Marcus drove her to Catherine's office, Claire's phone began to vibrate. Daniel. Then again. Then a text. "Baby, the restaurant called. You left your scarf. Everything okay? Getting a little worried." She read it once. She set the phone face down on her lap. "He's starting," she said. "He'll escalate," Sandra said from the back seat. First concerned husband, then frightened husband, then victimized husband who had no idea what was happening. He'll have the whole narrative constructed by morning. Another buzz. This one. "Claire, I'm home and you're not here. Please call me. I love you." Then, 7 minutes later, "Claire, where are you? I'm scared. Please, just let me know you're safe." The texts kept coming as they drove, each one a perfect performance, calibrated to the precise frequency of a worried spouse. Each one, Claire now understood, a data point. He was testing what she knew. He was measuring how much damage control he needed to do. At Catherine Park's office, the work began. By 12:30 in the morning, with 2 emergency court filings and a judge reached by phone, every account associated with Montgomery Design Group was frozen. Every credit card under Daniel's name was canceled. Every authorization he had accumulated over 2 years of patient, methodical positioning had been revoked in a single night. Daniel's phone started ringing constantly. She could see the notifications arriving even with her own phone face down. Then, at 12:52, a text that was different from the others. "Claire, something is wrong with our accounts. The bank is saying there's a freeze. Whatever Marcus told you, it isn't what you think. Let me explain, please." He knew she had talked to Marcus, which meant he had been monitoring something, or he was making an educated guess, or he was trying to preemptively shape the story she was building. "He's moving to Plan B," Sandra said, reading the message over her shoulder. "What is Plan B?" "He'll try to get you to meet him. He'll tell you it's a misunderstanding. He'll be the most convincing version of himself he has ever been because he has everything to lose." Sandra looked at her directly. "And Claire, I need you to understand, he is very good at this, better than anyone I have ever tracked. If you sit across from him and he has 10 minutes, there is a real possibility he makes you doubt what you know."
"Then we make sure he doesn't get 10 unrecorded minutes," Catherine said from across the conference table. She looked up from her legal pad with the expression Claire had seen her use before closing arguments.
"We set a trap,"
Catherine said.
"and we let his confidence do the work for us."
Claire looked at the table covered with evidence. 2.5 years. 1.9 million already gone. A plan that had been in motion since before she and Daniel had ever danced at a charity gala.
"Tell me what I have to do,"
she said. The trap Catherine described was simple enough to execute and dangerous enough to matter. Claire would go home. She would act as though she had experienced a minor panic attack, a brief, upsetting phone call from Marcus, old grievances, a moment of irrational fear that she had already begun to regret.
She would tell Daniel she had overreacted. She would tell him she was embarrassed. She would give him just enough of an opening that he would believe the operation was still salvageable. And while he performed his most convincing version of an innocent man, Sandra's team would be recording every syllable. "You understand what this requires," Catherine said. It was not a question. "I sit across from him and let him lie to my face," Claire said. "I've done harder things." Sandra looked at her steadily. "Not like this. These men are professionals. He has spent 2.5 years learning every micro-expression you make, every tell, every way your voice changes when you're uncertain. If he senses anything is off, he will pivot, and his pivot will be to disappear. Then I won't give him anything to sense." Marcus shook his head from across the table. "Claire, Marcus," she turned to look at her brother directly. "He chose me because he thought I was alone, because he thought losing Mom and Dad had made me soft and scared and easy. He spent 6 months studying the woman I was at my worst, and he never bothered to find out who I actually am." She picked up her coffee cup. "I've been in rooms with people trying to take things from me since I was 23 years old. I know how to hold a conversation. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Catherine said, "She's right. Let her do it." Sandra reached into her bag and produced a small device no larger than a coat button. "This goes in the lining of your jacket. Court-approved recording. I'll be in a car outside your house the entire time. Marcus is 2 blocks away. And Claire," she paused, "the moment you feel unsafe, you say the word comfortable in any sentence, any context. That's the signal." "Comfortable," Claire repeated. "Got it." Her phone buzzed on the table. Daniel again. This time, not a text, a call. Everyone in the room went still. Claire looked at the screen, looked at Catherine. Catherine gave a single nod. She answered, "Daniel." Her voice came out exactly right. Tired, slightly rough, the specific texture of someone who had been crying and was trying to sound like they hadn't. Oh, thank God. The relief in his voice was immediate and warm and completely convincing. "Claire, I have been out of my mind. Where are you? Are you okay? What is happening?" "I'm okay," she said. I needed some air. I talked to Marcus tonight." She let a small break enter her voice. "He said some things that scared me, and I reacted badly, and I froze the accounts without even talking to you first, and I'm embarrassed, Daniel. I'm really embarrassed." A beat of silence, just long enough to be the silence of a man recalibrating. "Hey," he said, and his voice shifted into something gentler. "Hey, listen to me. You don't have to be embarrassed. You got a call from your brother, someone who has been out of your life for 2 years, and he said things that scared you. That's completely understandable." "I should have called you first." "Yes," he said, and there was only the slightest edge in it, quickly covered. "But we can talk about that later. Right now, I just want you to come home. Can you come home?" "Yes," she said, "I'm coming home." She ended the call. She set the phone down on Catherine's conference table. Nobody in the room said anything for a moment. Then Sandra said quietly, "That was very good." Marcus was looking at his sister with an expression that was equal parts admiration and dread. "Be careful," he said. "Please." "I'll be careful," Claire said. "And Marcus," she stood up and picked up her jacket. "Thank you for not giving up on me even when I made it very easy to." He looked like he wanted to say something. Instead, he just nodded, which was, she understood, a Montgomery way of saying everything that didn't fit into words. The car ride home felt short. Sandra was already positioned before Claire's car turned onto her street. She could see, from the driveway, the living room light on. She sat in the car for 30 seconds and did what she had done before every significant negotiation of her professional life. She found the still point, the place behind the fear and the rage and the grief where the thinking happened cleanly. Then she went inside. Daniel was in the living room, and the man who met her at the door was not quite the man she had left at Harlow's. The composure was slightly off. His hair was not perfectly in place. His shirt was untucked in a way that read as worry, but that she now read differently, as a costume choice, the physical vocabulary of a concerned husband, worn on purpose. He pulled her into his arms before she reached the living room. "I'm so sorry," she said into his shoulder. "I completely panicked." "It's okay." He was rubbing her back in slow circles. "It's okay. You're home. We're going to figure this out together." She pulled back and looked at him and let her face do the work of a woman still slightly uncertain, still slightly raw, but fundamentally relieved to be back in a place that felt safe. "Can you show me?" she said. "The investment stuff Marcus was upset about. Can you walk me through it? I need to understand it so I know why I was wrong to be scared." Something moved through his expression so quickly she almost missed it. Not relief exactly, more like a door opening. "Of course," he said. "Absolutely. Come sit down." He opened his laptop. What he pulled up was extraordinary. Detailed spreadsheets, projected return rates, a comprehensive investment restructuring document that looked completely professional and completely legitimate. She recognized, watching him navigate through it, just how much preparation had gone into this moment. This was not something assembled tonight. This had been ready for weeks, possibly months, waiting for exactly this conversation. He walked her through every transfer, every shell company, every number. He gave each one a name and a purpose and a projected return, and his explanations were smooth and detailed and utterly convincing. And if she had not spent the last 4 hours in Catherine Park's conference room looking at Sandra Voss's documentation, she might have believed every word. "This is incredible," she said, and let genuine surprise color her voice. Because it was incredible, in the specific way that a very skilled criminal operation is incredible. "Daniel, why didn't you just show me this from the beginning?" "I wanted it to be finished first," he said. He turned to look at her, and the warmth in his face was so precise, so perfectly calibrated, that she felt the old pull of it even now, even knowing. "I wanted to come to you with a completed plan, not a half-built one. I wanted you to be proud of it." "I am," she said. "I'm really sorry I panicked." "Stop apologizing." He covered her hand with his. "Marcus gets in your head. He always has. That's what people do when they feel left behind. They try to pull you down to where they are." There it was, the redirection, the subtle, smooth repositioning of Marcus as the threat, as the destabilizing influence, as the jealous sibling who couldn't stand his sister's success. She had heard versions of this before and taken them as perspective. She heard it now as what it was, a tool. "You're probably right," she said. "In the morning," Daniel said, "we'll go to the bank together, reverse the freeze, and then I'll take you to meet Angela properly, our investment advisor. You can ask her anything you want. See all the paperwork yourself. I want you to be completely comfortable with everything." Comfortable. She filed it away. It wasn't her signal. He had used the word first. "That sounds perfect," she said. "I'm exhausted. Can we go to bed?" "Of course." He stood and took her hand. "Everything is going to be fine, Claire. I promise." She lay down next to him in the dark. She listened to his breathing slow and even out, and she thought about the particular obscenity of lying next to someone who had spent 2.5 years constructing a version of love precise enough to fool a smart, careful woman who had been paying attention. She did not sleep. At 6 a.m, her phone vibrated once with a text from Sandra. "He's already made 3 calls on a secondary phone, moving up the timeline. Be ready." By 7:30, Daniel was making breakfast and humming, which she now understood as the sound of a man who believed he was 24 hours from winning. She watched him from across the kitchen and thought about Renee Stafford in Philadelphia, who had lost her company and spent 3 years trying to get it back. She thought about Victoria Crane in Washington, who had gone silent for 2 years because the shame had been that heavy. She thought about however many women came before them, women whose names Sandra was still finding, women who had trusted the same warmth and the same patience and the same perfectly calibrated concern. "Big day," Daniel said, setting a plate in front of her. He was smiling. "Ready to put all this behind us?" "More than ready," she said. The bank meeting was at 10. The branch manager, a careful man named Peterson, who had been quietly briefed by Catherine the previous evening, met them in his office with the neutral, professional expression of someone managing a delicate situation. Claire signed the reversal documents with steady hands. She confirmed verbally, as required, that she was lifting the freeze order voluntarily. Daniel signed with barely concealed energy. His knee was moving under the table. "How quickly will the accounts be active?" he asked. "By early afternoon," Peterson said. "I can expedite given the circumstances. You should have full access by 2 o'clock." Full access by 2 o'clock. Claire watched Daniel absorb this information and file it with the precise efficiency of a man running a countdown. Outside the bank, he kissed her cheek and said he needed to handle some business. A few hours. He'd meet her at home for dinner. "Of course," she said. "Take your time." She watched his car pull away from the curb and then stood on the sidewalk in the November cold, and Sandra's voice came through the earpiece immediately. "He's heading toward the financial district. My team has eyes on him. He's going to meet with Delaney to initiate the transfers the moment the accounts go live." "How much time do we have?" "Accounts go live at 2. He'll move within minutes. Catherine has the injunction ready to file the moment he initiates. But Claire, we need him to actually initiate. We need the attempt on record or the criminal charges don't hold." "Then we let him try," she said. The next 4 hours were the longest of her life. She sat in her house and waited. Marcus called twice, and she answered both times and said nothing useful, and he understood. Sandra sent updates at intervals. Daniel meeting with Delaney, documents being reviewed, a third participant identified, a woman named Angela Marsh, whose name matched exactly what Sandra had told her the night before about the investment fraud specialist wanted in 2 states. At 1:47, her phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. "Baby, great news. The investment opportunity Angela identified. We need to move on it today. I'm handling all the paperwork from my end. You don't need to do anything. Just trust me. Just trust me." She read it 3 times. At 2:03, Sandra texted, "Accounts live. He's initiating." At 2:09, first transfer, 1.8 million, Cayman account. At 2:14, second transfer in progress. At 2:17, Catherine filed, injunction granted, transfers frozen mid-execution, police moving on Delaney's location now. Claire set her phone down on the kitchen table. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she let them shake, because there was nobody watching, and she had earned it. Outside the window, the November sky was the particular gray of a city that didn't care about your problems, and she thought about her father, who had sat at a table like this one during the worst year the company had ever had, and said to her, "The business will survive because we built it to survive, and we built it to survive because we knew the only thing we could actually control was whether we kept showing up." She was still here. She was still showing up. Her phone rang. Daniel. She answered. The warmth was gone. What was left was something flat and precise, stripped of all performance. "I know what you did," he said. "I know what you did too," she said. "Come home, David." The silence on the line lasted 4 seconds. Then the call ended. Sandra's voice came through the earpiece immediately. "He slipped the police at Delaney's building. He's heading your direction. We have units moving, but Claire, he's going to reach you before we do. Are you ready?" She looked at the front door. She looked at her hands. She thought about every room she had ever walked into where the odds were against her, every negotiation she had survived, every morning she had gotten dressed and gone to work in the year after her parents died, when the grief sat on her chest like a stone, and she went anyway because 62 people were counting on her to go anyway. "I'm ready," she said. 20 minutes later, Daniel's car pulled into the driveway. He didn't knock. He used his key, which was the first thing she noticed. Not the hesitation of a man coming home to apologize, not the careful approach of someone who understood he had been caught, but the automatic entitlement of a man who still believed, on some level, that this house and everything in it belonged to him. The door opened and David Holt walked into the living room. He looked different. Not dramatically different, not the way movies suggested a mask coming off would look, with some monstrous thing revealed underneath. He looked like the same man, same face, same build, same hands she had held for 2.5 years. But the quality of his attention had changed completely. He was not performing anymore. He was calculating, and the calculation was visible now in a way the performance never had been. And that visibility was somehow more frightening than anything else that had happened in the past 18 hours. He looked at her, sitting in the chair across the room, and he looked at the phone in her hand, and he looked at the jacket she was still wearing, and his eyes moved through the room in one quick professional sweep. "You're recording this," he said. Not a question. "Yes," Claire said. He absorbed that. He crossed the room and sat down in the armchair across from her, and it was such a familiar gesture, that exact chair, that exact way of sitting, the slight forward lean she had always read as engagement, that for one disorienting second, the whole past 2.5 years sat between them like a physical object. "How long?" he said. "Since Saturday night, the restaurant." He was quiet for a moment. She could see him running the timeline backward, recalculating every interaction of the past 3 days through the new information that she had known the entire time. She watched something move through his face that was almost, but not quite, respect. "Your brother," he said. "He hired a very good investigator." "Sandra Voss," he said the name flatly. "I know her work. She was FBI white-collar for 15 years. He paused. "I should have paid more attention to Marcus." "Yes," Claire said. "You should have. He was supposed to be out of the picture." 2 years of silence. I assessed him as a permanent absence. Something shifted in his jaw. That was a miscalculation. The word miscalculation, not a betrayal, not a wrong, not even a crime. A miscalculation. The clinical precision of it sent a cold line straight down Claire's spine, and she made herself hold still and hold his gaze and not let the cold show. "David," she said, using his real name deliberately for the second time, watching the slight involuntary tightening around his eyes each time she did it. "Tell me about Renee Stafford." The name landed. He was good enough that his face barely moved, but his hands did. A small, controlled adjustment of his position that she had learned to read over 2 years as the physical signal of something being filed away. "You've done your research," he said. "Sandra did. I just read the file." Claire kept her voice level. "Renee Stafford, Philadelphia. You were James Carter. She lost her company, her savings, her home. 3 years of legal fighting, and she lost everything anyway because the documentation was perfect." She paused. "Victoria Crane, Washington. You were Christopher Wells. She didn't even fight. She just disappeared." Something happened in his expression then. Not guilt. She had already stopped expecting guilt from him, had already understood that guilt required a framework he simply didn't possess. But something more interesting than guilt, something that looked, briefly and disturbingly, like pride. "Victoria was actually my cleanest operation," he said. 18 months from introduction to completion. No complications." "No complications," Claire repeated. She lost everything she had and called it a complication. "From my perspective," he said, without apology, without affect, that's what it was. The recording device in her jacket was capturing every word. She knew that. Sandra was in a car outside. Marcus was 2 blocks away. Federal agents were currently processing Frank Delaney and working their way through the financial documentation Sandra had assembled over 8 months. The trap had closed. David Holt was already finished, whether he fully understood it yet or not. But she wanted to understand, not for the case. Catherine had enough. For herself. Because she had given 2.5 years to this man, and she had loved him as completely as she knew how to love anyone. And she needed to hear him explain it in his own words, so that she could pick up every piece of it and know exactly what it had been. "Why me specifically?" she said, "out of everyone?" He looked at her for a long moment, and she had the sense that he was deciding something, not whether to answer, but how honest to be, whether she had earned a real answer. "You were the most complete profile I'd ever built," he said finally. "Most targets, there's a gap somewhere. A sibling who's still close, a friend who asks too many questions, an attorney who gets in the way. You had almost none of that. Your parents were gone. Marcus was gone. Your closest professional relationships were with people you paid, which means their loyalty had a ceiling. You were running a company that consumed most of your attention. You were lonely in the specific way that very successful people are lonely, surrounded by people who needed things from you, and no one who just wanted to be near you." He paused. "And you were brilliant," he said, which sounds like a compliment, but I mean it professionally. Smart targets are actually easier in some ways. They trust their own judgment. They don't second-guess themselves once they've decided to believe something. Once you decided I was genuine, you defended that decision internally. Every doubt you had, you reasoned away yourself. I barely had to do it for you. The honesty of it was worse than a lie would have been. "You studied me for 6 months," she said. 5.5. I introduced myself at month 6. "And the question, what are you afraid of?" She heard her own voice change slightly and steadied it. "You knew the answer before you asked." "You had given 2 interviews in the year after your parents died," he said. "Both times, when the interviewer got close to the personal, you said some version of nothing. I'm not afraid of anything. I've handled everything. You said it the same way both times, with that particular quality of someone who has decided that being afraid is not an option they can afford. I knew if I named it correctly, you would remember me. He had read her. He had read her from a transcript and a photograph and a professionally published interview, and he had built a key that fit the exact shape of what she needed, and she had opened the door herself, and she had been proud of how well she chose. Sandra's voice came through the earpiece, very low. Police are 60 seconds out. Keep him talking. The other women, Claire said. After me. If this had worked, who was next? Something crossed his face. Not hesitation. More like assessment. There's a woman in Seattle, he said. Tech executive. Widowed. 8 months ago. I had an introduction arranged for March. He said it the same way he might describe a business meeting. Scheduled. Planned. Already in motion. She has no idea, Claire said. She has no idea, he confirmed. Because of tonight, she never will. He looked at her with the specific quality of attention she had once called love and now understood as professional evaluation. You think stopping me stops the operation, he said. It doesn't. Frank is gone, yes. Angela is gone. But the infrastructure exists independent of any individual. There are people who do what I do. And there will always be women like Renee, like Victoria, like you. Women with money and grief and the human need to believe that someone means it when they say they love them. It was the cruelest thing he had said. Crueler than the admission about Renee. Crueler than the clinical discussion of Victoria. Crueler than the word miscalculation. Because it wasn't personal. That was the point. It was a structural observation. A market analysis, a statement about the permanent availability of vulnerable people and the permanent existence of people willing to exploit them. And it was delivered, she understood, with the specific intention of making her feel small, powerless, one node in a network too large to meaningfully damage. She had been waiting for this moment without knowing she was waiting for it. You spent 5.5 months studying me, she said. You studied my interviews, my professional history, my grief, my loneliness, my relationship with my brother. You built a complete profile. She held his gaze, and you completely missed the part where I built a $42 million company from a regional boutique studio in 7 years. You missed the 3 hostile takeover attempts I survived. You missed 11 major acquisitions. You missed the recession year where I kept 62 people employed when half our competitors folded. She paused. You studied who I was when I was broken. You never bothered to learn who I am. Something shifted in his face for the first time. Not dramatically. David Holt was too controlled for dramatic, but the professional assessment flickered, and underneath it was something she hadn't seen before. The specific expression of a person who has just understood, fully and irreversibly, that they have made an error they cannot correct. You're not going to run, he said. I was never going to run, she said. I was waiting for you to say enough. The front door opened. 2 federal agents came through it with the particular practiced efficiency of people who had done this many times. And 2 more came around from the back. And David Holt stood up from the armchair with his hands already moving away from his body, the automatic gesture of a man who had been in this position before and knew exactly how to handle it. He didn't struggle. He didn't shout. He turned and allowed his hands to be secured behind him, and he did it with a composure that was almost admirable, in the same way his whole operation had been almost admirable. Technically excellent, professionally executed, and fundamentally, irreparably wrong. At the door, one of the agents paused to let him through. David Holt stopped and turned and looked at Claire one last time across the living room. 2 years, he said. I wasted 2 years on you. Claire looked at him from across the room, from across the wreckage of a marriage that had never been real, and a love that had been the most sophisticated lie she had ever encountered. And she said the truest thing she knew. You didn't waste them, David. You lost them. There's a difference. He held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then the agent moved him through the door, and he was gone, and the room was suddenly full of Sandra, coming in from outside, and Marcus coming through the back, and Catherine on the phone, coordinating with the federal prosecutor's office. And the house that had been a stage set for 2.5 years was full of real people doing real work on behalf of a real outcome. Marcus reached her first. He put his hand on her shoulder and didn't say anything, which was exactly right. Sandra was already on her phone. Delaney is processed. Angela Marsh flagged at Logan. Interpol contact in place. The transfers are fully frozen. Catherine, we need the criminal referral filed before end of business today to capture the wire fraud attempt on record. Already filing, Catherine said from the hallway. Claire stood in the center of her living room and breathed. Outside, she could hear the sound of the police car pulling away. The November morning was still happening, indifferent and ordinary, the way mornings always are, regardless of what has just ended inside the houses they fall on. Her phone buzzed, a number she didn't recognize. She almost ignored it. She answered. "Mrs. Hayes?" The voice was female, professional, careful. "My name is Rebecca Cole. I'm an assistant U.S. attorney in the Boston field office. I've been briefed on what happened this morning. I'd like to meet with you today if possible. What David Holt was running is considerably larger than we initially understood, and I think you need to hear what we found." Claire looked at Marcus. He was watching her with the expression she had seen on their father's face 100 times. Steady, present, ready for whatever came next. "How much larger?" she said. Rebecca Cole took a breath. "We've identified 17 confirmed victims so far across 9 states. The earliest goes back 11 years. And Mrs. Hayes, 3 of those women didn't just lose their assets." A pause. 2 of them died. "We're not calling it homicide yet, but we're looking at it." The room went very quiet. Claire felt the ground shift under her feet in a way that had nothing to do with her own loss anymore. "Tell me where to be," she said, "and when." Rebecca Cole was 38 years old and had the specific quality of stillness that comes from spending a decade in federal prosecution, the ability to deliver devastating information without flinching, without softening it past the point of truth, without letting her own reaction contaminate the room. She met Claire and Marcus at the U.S. Attorney's field office 2 hours after David Holt was processed, and she set a folder on the conference table between them and let Claire open it herself. The folder contained 17 names. Claire read through them slowly. Women ranging in age from 31 to 67. Widowed, divorced, recently bereaved in some form in almost every case. Spread across 9 states over 11 years. Financial losses ranging from $400,000 to nearly $8 million. And at the bottom of the list, marked with a small notation in red ink, 2 names with dates beside them. Margaret Okafor, Cincinnati, died 14 months after her marriage to a man named Thomas Briggs. Cardiac event, ruled natural, 61 years old, no prior heart history. Diane Sellers, Atlanta, died 19 months after her marriage to a man named Richard Cole. Sleeping pill overdose, ruled accidental, 54 years old. Her children had questioned the ruling at the time and been told there was insufficient evidence to pursue further investigation. Claire looked up from the folder. "You think he killed them?" "We think it's worth a very serious look," Rebecca said. Both deaths occurred after the women became suspicious of financial irregularities. Both occurred before legal action was initiated. In both cases, David Holt, operating under different aliases, was the primary beneficiary of the estates. She paused. Margaret Okafor's estate was worth $6.2 million. Diane Sellers left an estate of $4.8 million. Both transferred cleanly. Marcus was very still beside Claire. His hands were flat on the table. The other 15 women, Claire said, he let them go. The other 15 either didn't become suspicious in time, or they became suspicious after the transfers were already complete and there was nothing left to protect by eliminating them. Margaret and Diane both caught inconsistencies early. Both confronted him. Both died within 6 weeks of that confrontation. The air in the room had a different quality now. Claire had walked in understanding that she had married a con man who had stolen from her and from other women. She was sitting now in the understanding that she had potentially married a man who had killed 2 people, and that her own confrontation with him 3 hours ago in her living room had been the kind of confrontation that had preceded 2 deaths. He knew, I knew, she said. He knew the entire time I was sitting across from him that I knew. And he came home anyway. Because by then, he had no viable exit, Rebecca said. The transfers were frozen, Delaney was in custody, Angela Marsh was flagged. His operation was finished. Coming to your house was either a final attempt to manage the situation, or... She stopped. Or he came to make sure I couldn't testify, Claire said. The word landed in the room like something physical. Marcus made a sound that was not quite a word. Sandra, who had been standing near the door the entire meeting, said quietly, "The moment he walked through that front door and saw you sitting there calmly, he assessed the situation and concluded the recording was running and the room was covered. That's why he sat down instead of escalating. He's too professional to act when the conditions aren't right." She paused, which means if the conditions had been different, if there had been no recording, no team outside, the conversation might have gone differently. "He would have hurt me," Claire said, not a question. "I think it's a serious possibility," Sandra said. "I want to be honest with you about that." The room was quiet for a moment. Claire felt something move through her that was not fear. The fear had passed, or was passing, burning through the specific realization of how close the margin had been. What replaced it was colder and more useful. The particular clarity that comes when you understand a thing completely and decide what to do with the understanding. "What do you need from me?" she said to Rebecca. "Everything. Your testimony about the entire relationship, from the gala to this morning. Every document you signed, every conversation you can recall where he discussed finances, introduced you to Delaney, discouraged you from consulting your own attorneys. And Claire," Rebecca's voice changed slightly, "I need you to call Renee Stafford and Victoria Crane. They'll talk to you in a way they won't talk to us. And if we're going to build a case that includes the homicide investigation alongside the fraud charges, we need every woman in this file willing to stand up in court." "I'll call them today," Claire said. She called Renee Stafford from the car on the way back to the house. Renee answered on the second ring with the wariness of someone who had learned to be careful about unexpected calls. Claire introduced herself in 2 sentences, said David Holt had been arrested that morning, and heard a sound on the other end of the line that she would not forget for a long time. Not crying, not relief, but a sharp exhale, like someone who had been holding a breath for 3 years and had finally been given permission to let it go. "I knew it," Renee said. Her voice was shaking. "I knew it wasn't just me. I knew there were others, and nobody believed me. And I spent 3 years being told I was bitter and delusional and—" "Claire," she stopped. "Are you okay? Did he hurt you?" "I'm okay," Claire said. "And Renee, I need to tell you something. We found 17 women. You are not alone. You were never alone. And now we have a federal prosecutor and 8 months of documented evidence, and we are going to make sure he never does this to anyone else." The silence on the line lasted long enough that Claire thought the call had dropped. Then Renee said, "What do you need from me?" "I need you in Boston, as soon as you can get here. I'll book a flight tonight." Victoria Crane was harder. She answered the phone with a voice so guarded it was almost toneless, the voice of a woman who had rebuilt herself by making herself very small, very difficult to reach, very unlikely to be heard again. Claire talked to her for 40 minutes. She didn't push. She told her own story first, all of it, and she let Victoria sit with it in silence, and she waited. "He called himself Christopher Wells," Victoria said finally. "He said his family made their money in shipping." "He told me railroads," Claire said. "He told Renee Stafford railroads too, actually. I think he had a preference for transportation." Victoria made a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. "I haven't talked about this out loud in 2 years," she said. "I didn't think I could. I thought if I said it out loud, it would be real again in a way I couldn't put back." "It's already real," Claire said, not unkindly. "It's been real this whole time. The only difference is whether we deal with it in the dark or in the light." A long pause. Then, "Are the other women, are they like us?" "They are exactly like us," Claire said. "Successful, careful, smart women who were targeted by a professional operation specifically designed to defeat exactly those qualities. There is nothing we should have known. There is nothing we should have done differently. He was very good at what he did." "Was," Victoria said. "Was," Claire confirmed. Past tense, as of this morning. Victoria was in Boston 2 days later. The week that followed was one of the most exhausting and most clarifying of Claire's life. Rebecca Cole's team was thorough and relentless in the best possible way. They worked 14-hour days building a case file that was, by the end of the week, over 3,000 pages of documentation. Sandra Voss worked alongside them, translating 8 months of investigative work into a form the federal prosecutors could use in court. Catherine Park filed 12 separate motions, covering everything from asset recovery to a preliminary civil action that would, if successful, allow the identified victims to recover their losses from the frozen accounts. And the women came. They came from Philadelphia and Washington and Cincinnati and Atlanta and 3 other cities Claire had not anticipated. Some came in person. Others joined video calls with the kind of careful, tentative energy of people who had been isolated by shame for so long that human connection felt dangerous. Every single conversation broke Claire's heart in a specific and different way, and every single conversation made her more certain that what she was doing was the only thing to do. Renee Stafford arrived from Philadelphia on a Thursday morning and walked into Catherine's conference room and stopped in the doorway when she saw the other women already there. Victoria and a woman named Linda Park from Cincinnati, who had been Margaret Okafor's daughter-in-law and had been fighting the fraud case independently for 2 years. And a woman named Carol James from Baltimore, who had lost her late husband's medical practice to the operation and hadn't told her adult children yet. Renee looked at them and pressed both hands over her mouth and stood there for a moment, and nobody said anything. And then Linda stood up and crossed the room and put her arms around a woman she had never met before, and Renee held on. Claire watched from the doorway and felt the particular weight of something that was grief and anger and fierce, determined hope all pressed together into a single thing with no good name. Then the phone on the conference table rang. It was Rebecca Cole, and her voice had the specific quality of controlled urgency that meant new information. "We have a problem," Rebecca said. "David Holt's defense team filed this morning. Catherine Walsh, she's one of the best criminal defense attorneys in New England. She's filing a motion to exclude the recording from your living room on the grounds that Massachusetts is a 2-party consent state and David did not consent to being recorded." The room went quiet. "Can she do that?" Claire asked. "She can argue it. Whether she wins depends on the judge. The court-approved wiretap on your phone is solid, but the device Sandra placed on you was approved for telephone communications, not in-person recording in a private residence. Walsh is going to argue it was obtained improperly." "The confession," Claire said. "If the recording is excluded, we still have the financial evidence, Delaney's cooperation, Angela Marsh's extradition, and the testimony of 17 women," Rebecca said. "We don't need the recording to convict on the fraud charges. But for the homicide investigation, Margaret Okafor, Diane Sellers, the recording was the only place where he came close to acknowledging a pattern of behavior that would support that line of inquiry." Claire thought about what David had said in her living room. The way he had described Margaret and Diane, the clinical language, the 2 deaths that had happened after confrontations that looked exactly like the one she had survived. He admitted to the pattern, she said. The other women, he described them. He said Victoria was his cleanest operation. "I know, and Walsh knows we have it," which is exactly why she's trying to get it excluded. She knows what's on that recording. Rebecca paused. "I need you to understand that this is going to get harder before it gets easier. Walsh is very good, and she is going to use every tool available. She is going to try to discredit you. She is going to try to paint this as a vindictive wife who used her financial power to destroy a husband who simply made some aggressive investment decisions. Let her try, Claire said. You say that now. Trials are long and they are personal, and Catherine Walsh is going to stand in front of a jury and say things about your judgment and your character and your motives that are going to be very hard to sit through. Rebecca, Claire looked around the table at Renee and Victoria and Linda and Carol. 4 women who had already survived what had been done to them, who had flown to Boston and walked into a conference room full of strangers and sat down because they believed it mattered. I have 17 women who are willing to stand up in court. I have 8 months of documented evidence. I have a federal prosecutor and the best private investigator in New England and an attorney who has been fighting for my family for 9 years. She paused. And I have nothing left to be afraid of. He already took the worst thing he could take, and I'm still here. What exactly does Catherine Walsh think she can do to me that's worse than what he already tried? Silence on the line. Then Rebecca said, Okay, here's what I need you to do. The preliminary hearing was set for 3 weeks out. In those 3 weeks, Claire did 3 things simultaneously and without stopping. She worked with Rebecca to prepare testimony that was airtight, chronologically precise, and immune to the kind of emotional destabilization that Catherine Walsh specialized in. She met with every identified victim individually and listened to every story completely, and helped each woman understand that her experience was not an isolated humiliation, but a documented pattern of criminal behavior conducted by a professional operation. And she began building something else, something that had started as a conversation with Renee Stafford over bad coffee in Catherine's conference room and had grown, quickly and with its own momentum, into a structure with a name and a purpose. They called it the Montgomery Foundation. Named for her parents, who had built their fortune honestly and who she believed would have wanted their name used for this. The night before the preliminary hearing, Marcus came to the house. They sat at the kitchen table with coffee, the way they had sat at tables together their whole childhood, and he said, "How are you actually doing?" She thought about it. Not the lawyer answer, not the public answer, not the answer she had been giving interviewers and federal prosecutors and the 17 women who needed her to be steady. "I'm angry," she said. "I'm going to be angry for a long time, and I think that's okay. I think the anger is correct." "It is," Marcus said. "I'm also—" She stopped, started again. "I keep thinking about the woman I was when he found me, at that gala, 2 years out from Mom and Dad, running the company and doing it well, but doing it alone, and so tired of doing everything alone." He looked at that woman and saw an opportunity. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I want to be angrier about that than I am. But mostly, I just feel sorry for her. She was doing her best, and she was so tired, and she just wanted someone to mean it." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Someone will," he said. "Mean it. Someday." "I know," Claire said. "But right now, I mean it. To myself. And that turns out to be enough." Her phone buzzed on the table. A text from Rebecca Cole. Walsh's motion to exclude the recording had been denied. The judge had ruled that the court-approved monitoring authorization was sufficiently broad to cover the in-person recording. The full confession was in. Claire read the message twice. Then she set her phone down and looked at her brother and felt the specific satisfaction of a door closing on something that could no longer hurt her. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," Marcus said. The federal courthouse in Boston was the kind of building that made you feel the weight of what happened inside it before you ever reached the door. Claire had been inside it 3 times in the past month for preliminary hearings, and each time she had stood on those front steps and made herself breathe before she went in. Not because she was afraid, because she had learned, over the past several weeks, that the moments just before something important required a particular quality of attention, and attention required breath, and breath required stillness, and stillness was something she had to choose deliberately when everything around her was moving fast. The trial of David Holt began on a Tuesday morning in January, 4 months after his arrest. By the time opening arguments were heard, the case had grown into something neither Rebecca Cole nor Catherine Park had fully anticipated when they started building it. 17 confirmed victims had become 22. The homicide investigation into Margaret Okafor and Diane Sellers had produced a forensic accountant's report showing that both women had been in the process of contacting attorneys about financial irregularities when they died. Margaret 3 days before her death, Diane 11 days before hers. Frank Delaney, operating under his cooperation agreement, had provided testimony that included a conversation in which David Holt had said, with the same flat professional affect Claire remembered from her living room, that sometimes a complication requires a permanent solution. Rebecca had read that line to Claire in her office 2 weeks before trial. Claire had sat with it for a long moment and then said, "He said something like that to me. He called Victoria Crane his cleanest operation. He said it like he was reviewing a project." "I know," Rebecca said, "and the jury is going to hear it." Catherine Walsh's opening statement was technically masterful and morally bankrupt in the specific way that good defense work sometimes had to be. She acknowledged the financial irregularities. She reframed them as aggressive but authorized investment decisions made by a man who had genuinely believed he was building something with his wife. She acknowledged the previous relationships. She reframed them as a pattern of unfortunate endings with women who had later chosen to coordinate their accusations for maximum legal impact. She was composed, persuasive, and completely in command of her narrative. And Claire sat in the front row of the courtroom and watched the jury watching Walsh and made herself stay very still. Renee Stafford testified on the third day. She had been preparing for 3 weeks. Claire had sat with her through 4 full practice sessions with Rebecca's team, watching Renee move from the careful, defensive posture of someone who had been disbelieved for 3 years to something straighter, more grounded, more certain. By the time she took the stand, Renee Stafford walked into that courtroom like a woman who had decided that her story was worth telling and that no cross-examination in the world was going to take that decision away from her. She testified for 2 hours. She was precise about dates and documents. She was unflinching about the emotional mechanics, the courtship, the trust, the gradual surrender of financial control to a man she had believed was her partner. And when Walsh cross-examined her, asking pointed questions designed to suggest that Renee had been a willing participant in risky investment decisions, Renee looked at her calmly and said, "I was willing because I trusted him. That's what trust looks like. If you've never trusted anyone completely, I understand why that might be confusing." 3 jurors visibly reacted. Walsh moved on quickly. Victoria Crane testified the following day. She was quieter than Renee, more internal, more careful with her words, and that restraint, paradoxically, made her testimony more devastating. She described David Holt's courtship with the specific detail of someone who had spent 2 years turning the experience over in her mind, examining it from every angle, understanding it more completely than she ever wanted to. She described the moment she realized what had happened, not the discovery of the financial fraud, but the earlier moment, the moment that preceded it, when she had tried to raise a concern with him and had watched his face do something it had never done before. It went very still, she said, not angry, not defensive, still, like a calculation was happening behind his eyes. She paused. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself I was being paranoid. I signed the documents the following week because I was more afraid of being the kind of woman who couldn't trust her husband than I was of the thing I had seen in his face. The courtroom was completely silent. Walsh's cross-examination of Victoria lasted 22 minutes. She ended it early. Claire testified on the 7th day of trial. She had been preparing for this since the preliminary hearing, and she had been, in a deeper sense, preparing for it since the night she sat in Marcus's apartment and heard Sandra Voss read a list of names. She knew what Walsh was going to do. She had read the defense's pretrial filings. She understood that Catherine Walsh was going to attempt to reframe the entire case as a story about a wealthy, powerful woman who had used her resources and her influence to dismantle a marriage that had simply become inconvenient. Rebecca walked her through the timeline chronologically, carefully, building the architecture of the operation piece by piece. Claire answered every question with the precision she brought to difficult board meetings, specific, factual, without embellishment, without the kind of emotional coloring that Walsh could use to suggest instability. She described the gala, the courtship, the wedding. She described the financial documents and the introductions to Frank Delaney and Angela Marsh. She described the anniversary dinner and Marcus's text, and the bathroom at Harlow's, and the drive to Cambridge. She described every conversation she had recorded in her own house, every word David Holt had said in his own voice, with his own face and his own complete absence of remorse. Then Walsh stood up. "Mrs. Hayes," she began, and Claire noted the deliberate use of the name that was David Holt's invention, the name that no longer belonged to her. "You've described my client as a professional predator who specifically targeted grieving women. But isn't it true that you pursued him first?" "I spoke to him at a charity event," Claire said. "He had approached me." "Isn't it true that you invited him to 3 separate professional functions within the first month of your acquaintance?" "Yes." "Isn't it true that you introduced him to your financial advisors and suggested he become involved in managing your assets?" "He suggested it." I agreed. "Isn't it true that you signed every document he presented to you voluntarily, with time to review, without coercion?" "I signed documents I believed were what he told me they were. They were not." Walsh paused. She was building towards something, and Claire could feel the architecture of it, the slow accumulation of yeses and admissions designed to arrive at a question that repositioned the entire story. "Mrs. Hayes, when you found out that your brother had hired a private investigator to look into your husband, did you feel angry?" "I felt frightened." "But also angry? At your husband?" "Yes, and within 12 hours of learning about the investigation, you had frozen every account your husband had access to, contacted a federal prosecutor, coordinated a law enforcement operation, and recorded a private conversation in your own home without your husband's knowledge?" "Yes." "That's a very organized response for a woman in shock." Claire looked at Catherine Walsh directly. "I've been running a $42 million company since I was 27 years old," she said. "Organized responses to crises are what I do. I'm sorry if that's inconvenient for your argument." 2 jurors looked away from Walsh. One of them was almost smiling. Walsh recovered. "Mrs. Hayes, isn't it possible that what you're describing as a sophisticated fraud operation was actually a marriage in which financial decisions were made collaboratively, and the breakdown of that marriage led you to reframe those decisions as criminal?" "No," Claire said. "It isn't possible." "How can you be so certain?" "Because he told me himself, in my living room, on the day of his arrest, with a recording running, he told me he had studied me for 5.5 months before we met. He told me I was the easiest mark he had ever worked. He told me Victoria Crane was his cleanest operation. He told me he told each of us whatever we needed to hear." She held Walsh's gaze without blinking. "That's not a marriage breaking down. That's a confession." Walsh tried 2 more approaches. Claire answered both with the same precision and the same absolute steadiness. After the second attempt, Walsh said, "No further questions," and sat down with the particular controlled expression of an attorney who knows she has not won the exchange. Rebecca stood for redirect. She asked one question. "Mrs. Hayes, in the recording from your living room, David Holt told you there was a woman in Seattle he had been planning to approach in March. A tech executive, recently widowed. Do you know what happened to that woman?" "She was contacted by the FBI the week after David's arrest," Claire said. "She had already been approached by a man using a new alias at a professional event 3 weeks earlier. She had given him her phone number. She said he was charming. She said he seemed genuinely interested in her work. A pause. She didn't know what she had almost walked into. Rebecca said, "Thank you. Nothing further." The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Claire sat in the hallway outside the courtroom with Renee on one side and Victoria on the other, and Marcus across from her and Catherine next to Marcus. And they didn't talk much. There wasn't much to say that hadn't already been said over 4 months of preparation and 3 weeks of trial. Renee had brought coffee in paper cups from the cart downstairs. Victoria was reading something on her phone that Claire suspected was not what it appeared to be. Victoria's way of managing anxiety was to look occupied. Marcus was sitting with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped, the exact posture their father had used when he was waiting for something important. At 4:17 in the afternoon, the jury came back. Guilty on all 26 counts: the wire fraud, the identity theft, the racketeering, and the count that the courtroom had been waiting for with a particular quality of held breath: 2 counts of second-degree murder in the deaths of Margaret Okafor and Diane Sellers, supported by Delaney's testimony, the forensic accounting, and the pattern of behavior documented across 11 years and 22 victims. David Holt stood and received the verdict with his face completely neutral, and Claire watched him from the front row and felt something she had been waiting to feel since the night she stood in a restaurant bathroom and called her brother. Not triumph, not relief exactly, something quieter and more permanent. The specific feeling of a door closing on something that can never open again. Walsh was already on her feet filing for appeal before the jury had been dismissed. Rebecca leaned over to Claire and said under her breath, "She'll appeal for 2 years and lose every motion. The evidence is airtight. He's not going anywhere." Sentencing was 4 weeks later. 28 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The judge addressed David Holt directly before pronouncing sentence, which was unusual enough that the courtroom noticed it. She said that in 22 years on the federal bench, she had seen many forms of fraud, many varieties of exploitation, many people who had caused serious harm to others in the pursuit of money or power. She said she had rarely seen anything as deliberate, as sustained, as technically sophisticated, or as fundamentally contemptuous of human beings as what David Holt had spent 11 years constructing. She said the 2 women who had died deserved to be named out loud in that courtroom: Margaret Okafor, Diane Sellers. And she named them, and the room was completely silent, and David Holt's face remained completely neutral throughout. He was led out in handcuffs without looking back. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded the group the moment they came through the doors. Claire had prepared a statement with Catherine and Rebecca, 3 paragraphs, carefully worded, legally sound. She had the paper in her jacket pocket. She did not take it out. She looked at the cameras and said what she actually meant. 22 women, she said. That is the number of lives this operation touched. 22 women who were targeted at their most vulnerable, who were studied and courted and deceived with extraordinary skill, who lost money and companies and years of their lives, and in 2 cases lost everything. Those women are not a statistic. They are the most capable, resilient, determined people I have ever met, and they are the reason this verdict happened. She paused. If you are watching this, and something feels wrong in your own life, if someone who says they love you is gradually, gently, very patiently gaining access to your finances, your decisions, your isolation from the people who knew you before they arrived, please trust that feeling. The shame belongs to them, not to you, never to you. She folded the prepared statement back into her pocket and walked down the courthouse steps with Marcus beside her. And for the first time in longer than she could precisely remember, the cold January air felt clean. The Montgomery Foundation opened its permanent headquarters 6 months after sentencing. The opening event was not a gala. Claire had not been to a charity gala since the night she met David Holt and did not intend to start again, but a working meeting practical and purposeful, attended by the 22 women from the case, 7 FBI agents from the White Collar Crime Division, 4 federal prosecutors, and a group of financial literacy educators Renee had recruited from 3 universities. Renee ran the education programs. Victoria led communications. Linda Park, Margaret Okafor's daughter-in-law, coordinated the legal aid clinic. Carol James from Baltimore, who had finally told her adult children about what happened to her and discovered to her own tearful astonishment that they were not ashamed of her, but furious on her behalf, ran the Survivor Outreach Network. And Sandra Voss, who had declined a full-time position but accepted a permanent consulting contract, was already 3 months into an investigation of a man in Denver whose pattern of behavior had been flagged by 2 of the Foundation's partner organizations. His current target was a 60-year-old widow who had inherited her late husband's logistics company. She had met him at a professional conference. She thought he was the real thing. She had not yet signed anything. Sandra's report landed on Claire's desk on a Thursday morning, and Claire read it at her office at Montgomery Design Group, the company her parents had built, the company she had kept alive through grief and recession and a hostile takeover attempt, and the most sophisticated personal betrayal she had ever survived. And she picked up the phone and called Rebecca Cole, and within 4 hours, the woman in Denver had been contacted by a Foundation advocate who told her, gently and specifically and without drama, exactly what she needed to know. The woman in Denver did not sign anything. She called the FBI herself the following morning. That afternoon, Marcus texted Claire a single line. Dad would have been proud. She read it sitting at her parents' old desk in their old company, in the life they had built for her and that she had rebuilt for herself. And she thought about the question David Holt had asked her the night they met. What are you afraid of? And she thought about the answer she had given. And she thought about the answer she would give now. She was afraid of nothing that had a name. She was afraid, in the productive way, of the women who hadn't been found yet, the ones still sitting across candlelit tables from men who had studied them for months and were waiting for exactly the right moment. The ones who would wake up tomorrow or next month or next year to a text from someone who had not given up on them and who would have somewhere to go and someone who believed them and a network of women who had walked the same road and come through the other side intact. That fear was not paralyzing. That fear was the entire point. Claire Montgomery closed Sandra's report, picked up her phone, and went back to work. She had a company to run, a foundation to build, and 22 women at her back who had taught her the most important thing she had ever learned, that the people who try to break you by finding you at your worst have already made their fatal mistake. They found the woman she was when she was grieving. They never saw the woman she became. And that, in the end, was exactly why they lost.